When was the last time you drank a glass of water or ate a meal or took a breath of air and didn't consume plastic? Because the answer, whether you realise it or not, is probably never. So earlier this year, a paper came out in Nature Medicine, and it has been literally everywhere. And the reason this paper blew up is that the researchers found microplastics in every single human brain sample they tested. Not just traces of plastic, they estimated that the human brain was roughly 0.5% plastic by weight. 0.5% of your brain is plastic. And they found these particles in pretty much every major organ in the human body, including the liver, the kidneys, the lungs, the placenta, breast milk, blood, the testes, the semen, arterial plaque, literally everywhere. So what we're going to do in this video is talk about what microplastics actually are. We're going to talk about how they get into the body and why so much of that comes down to the things that we do every single day without thinking about it. We're going to talk about whether the research is compelling enough to be genuinely worried about things like cancer or long-term chronic disease, and what we can actually do about all of this. If you're new here, then hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I've worked in emergency medicine for a decade, and now I'm sharing everything I know with you to help you prevent the diseases that I see all the time. And if you learned something from this video today, then please support what I'm doing here by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really does make a massive difference. So what are microplastics? Well, microplastics are basically just plastic fragments smaller than 5 millimeters, roughly the size of a grain of rice or smaller. But the ones really generating scientific concern right now are what we call nanoplastics, which are even tinier, so small you could never see them with the naked eye, and small enough to slip through the body's natural defenses. That's really the key point about size here. The smaller the particle, the deeper into the body it can travel, the more easily it can get inside your cells, and the more toxic chemicals it can carry on its surface. Think of this a bit like dust versus a stone. A stone just sits there, but fine dust gets into everything. And it's also worth mentioning PFAS here as well, PFAS, basically what we call forever chemicals, because they don't break down in the body or in the environment. They travel with a lot of the same plastics and food packaging as microplastics, and they carry their own separate concerns around hormone disruption and cancer risk. They're a slightly different problem here, but they share the same source. And when people talk about plastic exposure, they're often unknowingly talking about PFAS exposure at the same time. So let's just include them in this video. But how do they get into the body? Well, the routes into your body are more numerous than most people actually expect. And a lot of this is hiding in completely normal daily behavior. Drinking bottled water is one of the most consistently documented sources. Imagine the inside of a plastic bottle like a very, very slow melting wax candle, where instead of wax that's dripping out, it's microscopic plastic particles leaching silently into the liquid. And every squeeze, every rise in temperature, every extra day it sits on a shelf speeds that process up. Now, heating food in plastic containers makes it much, much worse because heat breaks the plastic down faster and pushes particles straight into your food. And this is the reason you should never microwave your food in plastic. The other thing that people think of is plastic chopping boards. And what these do is shed particles directly into your food every time a knife runs across the surface. Tea bags is another one. So the kind made from synthetic mesh rather than paper, these release millions of particles into your hot water. Canned foods as well are often lined with sort of like a plastic resin on the inside that leaches into the food. Seafood is worth mentioning as well, particularly shellfish like mussels and oysters and clams. And they filter enormous volumes of seawater to feed and actually stay alive. And in doing so, accumulate microplastics in their tissue, which we then eat. And a really surprising one is actually just breathing indoor air, which is a significant route that most people completely overlook because household dust carries things like tiny fibres from your synthetic carpets or furnishings and clothing that we're then breathing in constantly. And obviously, as a result of that, you can add children to the list of people who need particular attention here. You know, babies and toddlers crawl around with their faces right at carpet level, mouthing plastic toys and licking everything inside. And studies have actually found the levels of microplastics in the stools of young people to be significantly higher than in adults. The picture that builds up here is that exposure is happening across almost every part of the day, mostly invisibly and mostly through habits that feel completely normal. Now, I want to talk about that brain study in a bit more detail here. So the Nature Medicine paper published in February 25 by researchers at the University of New Mexico is one that really shifted things. And it seems like it sparked all of these documentaries that you're seeing on the TV at the moment. What it showed is that plastic concentrations in the brain appeared higher than in the liver or the kidneys or the placenta or the testes. They compared brain tissue from 2016 with tissue from 2024, and the accumulation appeared to have increased by roughly 50% over just 8 years. Now, the reason the brain might be more vulnerable comes down to fat. The brain is the fattiest organ in the body, around 60% fat, and plastics tend to stick to fatty tissue really well. There's also a protective barrier between the blood and the brain called the blood-brain barrier, which normally stops harmful things getting through. Now, the concern is that the smallest plastic particles may be able to sneak past it to get through. And then we've got the link to dementia, and this is the part of the study that really gets us quite worried. So brain tissue from people with diagnosed dementia had 3 to 5 times more plastic in the brain compared to those people without. Now, that doesn't mean that microplastics cause dementia. This was tissue studied after death. It could easily be that a brain already damaged by dementia is simply less able to flush these particles out, if that makes sense. Experts have cautiously suggested that higher levels in dementia may be a consequence of the disease rather than a cause of it. There's also been legitimate scientific pushback. A response piece in the same journal raised quite big concerns about contamination controls and whether the measurements were fully reliable. And that kind of scrutiny is exactly how science should work. But multiple detection methods confirmed the particles were there, and independent researchers have found the overall finding quite credible. So we can't ignore this. And there's another part of this that tends to get quite lost in this conversation about microplastics and the brain, and that is all to do with Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's happens when a protein in the brain starts to fold in the wrong shape and then clump together, slowly damaging the cells that control movement. Now, nanoplastics have been shown in experimental models to trigger exactly that kind of clumping. Now, obviously, this isn't proven yet, but it is a specific biological mechanism, so it absolutely could be true. And Parkinson's rates have been rising globally for decades in a way that isn't fully explained. So, this could be a really important link. Whether microplastics are part of the answer, we don't fully know yet. I reckon in a few years' time, all of this will become a lot clearer. Let's talk about the heart for a moment. So the study here came from the New England Journal of Medicine in 2024. Now, researchers looked at patients undergoing surgery to remove a dangerous fatty buildup inside one of the main arteries in the neck called the carotid artery. And this is the artery that supplies blood to the brain, and when it gets blocked, it causes stroke. So it's pretty important. And when they examined the plaque that was removed, roughly half of the patients had microplastics inside it. And those patients had a significantly increased risk of death or major cardiovascular events compared to those who had no microplastics in their plaque. Heart attack, stroke, or death occurred in 20% of patients with microplastics in their plaque versus 7.5% in those without. Now, obviously, that is an association. It is not proven causation yet. Some researchers raised concerns about, again, potential contamination from the surgical environment itself, and this is a population already seriously unwell, so we can't apply those numbers directly to healthy people. But heart attacks and stroke and death are about as hard an outcome as the clinical research can measure. You can't really get much worse than death. And a difference that big, even though it's not proven to be causal yet, is really difficult to ignore. The hormone side of the story doesn't get anywhere near enough attention, and it starts with understanding what your endocrine system actually does. So your endocrine system is basically the body's hormonal messaging network. It controls everything from fertility to metabolism to your mood, your growth, using chemical signals called hormones. Now, many plastic additives are what scientists call endocrine disruptors, meaning they interfere with that messaging system by mimicking or blocking the body's natural hormones, essentially sending fake signals that confuse the whole network. Chemicals linked to plastics, including the well-known one called BPA, are known to interfere with testosterone production, with sperm development, egg development, and how the placenta forms during pregnancy. Studies in mice who have been fed plastic particles found reduction in sperm count and sperm quality, as well as lower testosterone, raising this big question of whether microplastics are contributing to this long-running decline in male fertility seen over the last 80 years. The human data, as with everything in this sort of conversation, because it's so new, isn't conclusive yet, but the mechanism is plausible and the animal evidence is consistent. And given the global trends in sperm counts, this is something that we need to take really seriously. And then we've got your gut, which is actually where most of these ingested microplastics first land. So your gut lining is basically one of your body's main protective barriers. It lets nutrients through into the bloodstream while keeping harmful things out, a bit like a very fine net. When that lining gets damaged or inflamed, it becomes leaky, and things that shouldn't get into the blood start to be let in. Exposure to microplastics has actually been linked to a reduced diversity of healthy gut bacteria, increased harmful bacteria, damage to the gut's protective mucus layer, and increased inflammation as well. The gut also communicates directly with your brain. It's called the gut-brain axis. So persistent gut inflammation from microplastics could have effects that reach far beyond the stomach. There is now evidence that microplastics can move from the gut into other parts of the body with knock-on effects on the immune system and the nervous system as well. Now, whether we're just stuck with this because it's just part of normal life now is probably the most important question. And the honest answer is, to a significant degree, yes, we probably are stuck with a lot of this. Even if plastic production stopped tomorrow, it would still be a very slow-moving problem. I don't think we can eliminate this entirely because it takes decades for existing plastic to break down into the tiny particles that end up in the body, meaning levels in the environment will keep rising for decades and decades, regardless of what we do. Think about car exhaust fumes and smog and pollution in cities. There were decades where that was just accepted as the background condition of modern industrial life before the evidence became too heavy to ignore. Microplastics feel like they're following a similar trajectory. We're also not recycling our way out of this either. Globally, only around 9% of plastic actually gets recycled. The rest is either incinerated or landfilled or ends up somewhere in the environment or the seas or on the beaches, basically anywhere, slowly breaking down into particles that eventually find their way into the food chain and into us. And obviously it's far too early to say for certain because the science is so new in this space, but there's a very good chance that microplastics are linked to many of the major chronic diseases that we see all the time. The burning question on most people's lips, I'm sure at this stage, is can we actually get rid of microplastics out of the body? Can we sort of detox them out of our system? The answer, from what I can gather, is not really, at least not in the way that the internet sort of suggests, often when they're trying to sell you something. So some microplastics do pass through the digestive system and get excreted, but the smaller nanoplastics can cross biological barriers throughout the body and then accumulate in your tissues. And the body doesn't have a specific mechanism to dissolve or remove them once they're embedded into an organ like the brain or the placenta. What you can do, though, is actually support your body's general detox systems, things like your liver, your kidneys, and your gut, which is basically just eating well, staying hydrated, exercising, and not overloading those systems with other things like alcohol. There's actually some really interesting emerging data suggesting that the toxic chemicals from plastics, things like BPA, may be mobilized through sweat, which is one reason why exercise and sauna use comes up a lot in this sort of conversation. But anybody selling you a specific supplement or a protocol to flush microplastics out of your brain is getting well ahead of the evidence here. The most powerful thing that anybody can do is to reduce what's actually going in, not chase what's already there. Filtered tap water is going to be significantly better than bottled water. This is probably one of the best things that you can do, actually. In the kitchen, the principle is pretty simple. You want to keep plastic away from heat, and you want to keep plastic away from food, wherever it's possible. So glass and stainless steel for storage, especially with anything hot, wooden rather than plastic cutting boards, and never microwave in plastic containers. Always use ceramic or glass instead. And the really, really big one here is try and stay away from these non-stick pans. Instead, try and use stainless steel or cast iron. You also want to try and look at your tea bags as well. You want to see if they use a synthetic mesh or whether it uses proper paper tea bags, because switching to loose leaf tea or proper paper is a really small change with surprisingly big results in this sort of microplastic space. And using a vacuum cleaner that uses a proper HEPA filter, HEPA, is another change that addresses the indoor dust routes that most people don't think about. Choosing natural fabrics over synthetic ones where it's practical, and then washing synthetics on a shorter, cooler cycle reduces the fibre load going both into the water and the air in your home. Another big one is eating less ultra-processed food. This helps on two different fronts. Less plastic packaging and less particle contamination from the food processing itself. And then we've got sleep, which is another interesting route. So the brain has its own overnight waste clearance system called the glymphatic system that essentially flushes out the brain during your sleep. It clears out metabolic waste and toxins. And while it hasn't been proven to clear microplastics specifically, it's the closest thing the brain actually has to a cleaning mechanism. And consistently poor sleep is probably the last thing that you want when particles are building up in your brain tissue. Now, obviously, none of these things are a cure. None of it gets you to zero exposure. But reducing the daily dose is almost certainly the right direction of travel. And really the best things on those lists are not using plastic bottles, not microwaving your food in plastic containers, and not using non-stick pans and plastic chopping boards. To any of you that are still quite skeptical about all of this, if any of you still have any doubt that this is actually a problem, let me just end with this. Microplastics in human organs is now incredibly well documented, and this is not going to go away as a finding. The exact health impact is still uncertain, but that doesn't mean it's not important. The reasons to be concerned here, the inflammation, the hormonal disruption, the gut damage, the cardiovascular associations, and the sheer scale of accumulation in your brain tissue, these are all building up. As with everything that's quite new, panic is not the right response, but neither is the It's everywhere, so why bother sort of response. If I look at what's actually reducing my patients' lives day to day, it's obesity, it's high blood pressure, it's insulin resistance, inactivity, smoking, poor sleep, alcohol. Those risks are far larger than microplastics right now. So my advice here would be this. Get those right first, watch other videos on this channel and focus on your insulin resistance and your blood pressure and your diet and your activity level, and then reduce your plastic exposure where it costs you nothing to do so. And also just watch this space, because the science here is moving incredibly fast and the story is far from finished.